welcome to the Indigenous-Settler Relations Collaboration October webinar. My name is Sarah Madison, one of the co-directors of the ISRC, and I'll be your host this morning. Before I do anything else, though, I would like to introduce Uncle Tony Garvey, Wurundjeri elder, to welcome us to country. Uncle Tony? Uncle Tony, for that welcome. The ISRC's relationship with Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people and organisation has been really foundational to the way we've thought about ourselves and our place on Wurundjeri territory, and we are grateful as always for the generosity that you show to us and the many ways in which we've been able to engage over the last few years. So thank you. We pay our respects to you and to all Wurundjeri Woiwurrung elders and ancestors, and look forward to continuing to nurture that relationship into the future. I also need to acknowledge, because although I normally live and work on Wurundjeri territory, I'm not there at the moment. I'm currently on land shared by Bunurong and Gunai Kurnai nations, so I also pay my respects to Bunurong and Gunai Kurnai elders and ancestors. And as we finally emerge from the world's longest lockdown, I pay my respects to all the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples for the great care and respect that they've shown to these territories that we now call Australia, and that for many of us have been our only points of sanity, as we've been able to have our 1 hour of exercise outside of our homes for the last few months. So thank you for that, that care and respect that you've shown to your countries. We are very honoured this morning to have Associate Professor Lorenzo Veracini present to us. Just before I introduce Lorenzo, who has also been a great friend to the ISRC, just a couple of housekeeping matters. There is a Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. That is how we will be taking questions towards the end of Lorenzo's presentation. So Lorenzo is going to speak for about half an hour, and then we should have a decent amount of time for Q&A at the end. The chat function is not functioning. We do have closed captioning happening, and this event is also live streaming on Facebook. Please do engage as much as you can through the Q&A function, and I will curate those questions for Lorenzo before we finish. Okay, to the main event. Let me please introduce Associate Professor Lorenzo Veracini. Some of you, in fact, I'm sure many of you are very familiar with his name and his work. Lorenzo has been one of the leading theorists of settler colonialism in Australia and globally. He's Associate Professor in History and Politics at Swinburne's Institute for Social Research, where he continues to work on the comparative history of colonial systems and settler colonialism. You'd be familiar with many of his books, including Settler Colonialism, A Theoretical Overview, The Settler Colonial Present, and the big Routledge Handbook of the History of Settler Colonialism that he co-edited. So Lorenzo, if you are ready to go, I will turn my camera off and turn over to you, and see you, Uncle Tony. Thanks so much for being here, and hand you the floor.
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Tony. It's wonderful to be here. My plan today is to read the paper I wrote, but because I will only be able to speak for 30 minutes, I will not read the middle part, and I'm happy to share the draft should anyone be interested in reading what they missed out. So, a few preliminary notes about me, your speaker, today's speaker. I'm a settler, and while I resist and resent colonialism, I'm not an ally in Indigenous struggles. Allies are difficult. They have needs that must be managed. They are often exhausting as they demand draining emotional labor of the Indigenous people who undertake to educate them. Accomplices are more needed than allies, as Indigenous Action, a group from Arizona, argued. Historically, Indigenous people have at times supporters amongst the settlers. Take the humanitarians in the 19th century or the communists in the 20th. Both groups supported Indigenous struggles with extraordinary conviction, but they did so because of their personal convictions and because they were focused on another life, either beyond this one or a future life in a new world where everyone would get according to their needs. They did not support Indigenous struggles because they had a direct stake in the fight. They proved unreliable. I aim to be different. I'm fighting against colonialism for a better life, my life, and that of my children and that of those in my community. This life, not another one that I will not have. I am a co-belligerent, not an ally, and really not an accomplice either. We are not talking here about any crime. I'm a settler, but I aim to be something else, and I'm going to be more reliable than my predecessors. The bar is very low anyway. As a co-belligerent in the struggle against settler colonialism, and unlike other allies, I refrain from acknowledging country. I'm honored if an Indigenous person welcomes me to her country, but I, like others, remain skeptical of cheap, institutionally mandated gesturing. Not because I resent attempts to craft less violent ways of narrating settler belonging, but because I understand, with Jacques Derrida, that only sovereigns can genuinely offer a welcome. There is knowledge in acknowledgement, and an acknowledgement that is not premised on an Indigenous knowledge of country should be better described as a misacknowledgement. I pay the rent, however. This is Indigenous country, and settlers do not need to state this fact, just like we do not need to say that we are all sons and daughters of Mother Gravity. Anyway, a preliminary statement is a practice Indigenous protocols rarely envisage. We may be better off walking country in culturally appropriate ways rather than speaking about it. On the other hand, I'm fighting for a better and sustainable collective relationship to the land I live on, and know that the best I can do is to be a respectful guest under Indigenous sovereignty. Besides, I am a settler, but also a migrant. Either way, an invited visitor, but they're not the same. And without settler colonialism, perhaps one day I will also become a respected guest. Settlers, like anyone else, are more than one thing at any given time, especially considering that the subject position of a settler involves by definition permanent movement and domination, two things at least. This complexity, the spectrum of possibility going from permanent movement and domination and permanent movement and subjection, has been explored by Jody Bird, for example, who has emphasized the category of irrelevant, and more recently by Evinel Espiritu, who has put forward the concept of refugee settlers and refugee settler colonialism. Similarly, focusing on United States-occupied Hawaii, Candace Fujikane developed the notion of settler Hawaiiana. Settlers can be protectors of lands and waters, she argued, if they respect and uphold Indigenous sovereignties and if they uphold Indigenous modes of relating to the lands they dwell on. Fujikane convincingly reminded us that settlers are always already simultaneously positioned as both subjugated by settler state power and as settlers. Besides, as a migrant to a land of settlers and Indigenous peoples, I know that this is not my country anyway. Migrants and refugees, by definition, move towards someone else's country. They inhabit the space that one can carve between ejection and rejection, or qualified acceptance. You try, make a living, and walk away from a country that hates you to one that does not want you. You try this gaunt inhabitants that never turns into home, and try and see it from the perspective of migrants. For migrants, it is never sovereignty. We witness a settler colonial sovereignty that is asserted and remains effective, or conversely, an Indigenous one that is denied and yet survives. For migrants, sovereignty is always elsewhere. For Indigenous peoples and for settlers, sovereignty is political life. For migrants, sovereignty is like the Epicurean understanding of death. If migrants are, then sovereignty is not, because they have left. And if sovereignty is, then the migrants are not, because they are already settlers. We are the unsovereigns. I believe that settlers can be better than just settlers. Let me explain with an analogy. Jacqueline Roses recently reflected on violence against women. She carefully distinguishes between men that challenge violent masculinity and those who do not. And I'm reading from her work. Male violence is the standout feature of the day, but it is also central to my argument that the masculinity enjoyed on all men and paraded by so many is a fraud. On this, I take my distance from radical feminism, notably that of the influential school of Catherine McKinnon and Andrea Dworkin, which sees violence as the unadulterated and never-failing expression of male sexuality and power, a self-defeating argument if ever there was one. If true, then men will rule the world forever. Instead, it is crucial for me that even while calling out masculinity in its worst guise, we allow to individual men the potential gap between maleness and the infinite complexity of the human mind. How can we as feminists make that gap the beating heart of women's fight against oppression, against the stultifying ideology of what women are meant to be, and not allow the same internal breathing space to men? Rose is a feminist, and she can be generous. No man should demand the same generosity. But an analogous approach could be entertained when thinking the role and position of settlers in decolonial practices. Likewise, not all settlers are violent or determined to rely on the silent compulsion of settler colonialism as a mode of domination, another form of violence. Settlers are not inevitably violent because they are settlers. We are not doomed to forever be an expression of settler colonialism. As a mode of domination, it will be undone by indigenous resistors and by their settler co-belligerents. So, what is the place of settlers in a decolonizing struggle? Or, to paraphrase William J. Wilson's famous 1860 expression, what shall we do with the settlers? Wilson was a Black man in a United States torn apart by civil war, who, speaking about what shall we do with the white people, was ironically responding to routine concerns expressed by white men about the future of Black people. Some would say they simply do not have a role, which is not a political response, and others simply would not look into the question, wishing the question away, which is also not a political response. What are the decolonized relationships settlers may entertain with their places and their traditional owners? Can scholars help crafting decolonial moments? Sarah Madison and Sana Nakata's call for scholarship able to traverse the interface between indigenous nations and settlers, they focus on relationality. Their invitation departs fundamentally from a widespread scholarly stance that, on the contrary, aims to explore the experience of indigenous peoples in an exclusive fashion. I'm drawn to Madison and Nakata's call for a relational appraisal. As Foucault argued, he was relying on the Marxian intuition that domination is a relation. Power is always relational. Relationality, however, must be premised on some form of recognition, because even misrecognition is a relation. Recognition has indeed been a topic of interest in discussions concerning indigenous-settler relations under settler colonialism. My intervention focuses on a contextual approach of recognition, hence my claim to originality in a multivocal and interdisciplinary debate. There is a legal meaning of recognition, there is a philosophical meaning of recognition, and there is a psychological meaning of recognition. And we should be aware of the specific registers according to which recognition is mobilized in public and scholarly discourse, as well as of the shifts between these registers. Similarly and relatedly, reconciliation also needs to be understood contextually, because there is a Judeo-Christian theological version of reconciliation, for example, and there is an understanding of reconciliation that derives from the language of accounting, and they're not the same. And when talking about reconciliation, it is often unclear if we have even agreed on what we are talking about. A contextual approach is necessary, in my opinion, because the very notion of recognition begs the question, recognition of what? Ulru's statement from the heart productively focus on the basis of indigenous participation in discussions about recognition, truth, treaty, and voice. This TTV model is an excellent start, and it is precisely because it was a sound proposal that it was not taken seriously by the Morrison administration, which rejected this statement. This Australian government resented especially the voice element of the proposal, as if there could be any recognition without the possibility of uttering it. The government's response was trapped by a history of non-recognition. But we may productively zoom out. It is not only about clarifying the conditions of possibility for Indigenous recognition generally and constitutionally and in Australia. An understanding of the epistemologies of recognition is needed because it enables a constructive framing of the contestation surrounding the politics of recognition globally. Recognition is a global predicament. Indeed, there is currently a global uneven geography of engagement with the politics of recognition in the Indigenous transnational world. Some Indigenous struggles in some locales facing particular settler colonial political traditions find the concept valuable and mobilize for recognition, while others facing different and yet still thoroughly settler colonial traditions find it detrimental. The former demand recognition as a necessary prerequisite for a decolonial passage, the latter mobilize against recognition. Where recognition is denied or even foreclosed by the settler polity, it is demanded by Indigenous movements. Where it is offered, it is rejected, which proves that it is not that Indigenous struggles are always right, but rather that it is settler colonialism that it is always wrong. A contextual reading of different modalities of settler colonial domination is a necessary key to understand this uneven geography, this uneven geography of engagement is a current feature of Aboriginal Australia too, and metropolitan Aboriginal constituencies have different priorities than those of regional and remote Aboriginal communities. And the same could be said to apply in the United States. For example, we can reflect productively on the off-res, on-res Indian dialectic and the political cleavages that follow from this opposition. Recognition cannot be simply a process whereby a sovereign subject is identified and addressed, even it is also that. As if someone existed already and was fully formed and unchanging, and then they met someone else in the street, and this encounter was only incidental to their being, a mere addition to their life. Recognition is necessarily relational, a point underscored, for example, by Dominic O'Sullivan, who, following Nancy Fraser, recently emphasized the notion of participatory parity. In other words, the collectives that engage in an act of reciprocal recognition would not exist without each other. This relationality is inevitable and does not affect recognition only. It affects the mutually constituting collectives themselves. This mutual constitution is already inbuilt in settler colonialism as a mode of domination, even if relationality, in the case of contemporary Australia, has not yet taken the shape of recognition. As Fanon intuited, despite sustained attempts to compartmentalize and separate colonizer and colonized, a whole system of domination bent on compartmentalizing the settler collective would not exist as settler without the Indigenous collective. And the Indigenous collective would not exist as Indigenous without the settler exogenous collective. Because of an unavoidable relationality, recognition must be the outcome of a dialectical process that includes the historical modalities that constituted the subjects that are to be addressed. This is the problem of the settler politics of recognition. Recognition is typically framed as an addition, as if the settler sovereign existed and the Indigenous one was brought into existence through the recognition. It is a profoundly solipsistic and narcissistic proposition, a very unhealthy state of mind and consciousness. That it should be considered normal says a lot about the collective psychology of settler collectives, a point I intend to return to in the second part of my intervention today, which is the part I will not read. In other words, the subjects of genuine recognition exist prior to recognition. They are not constituted by it, even if they are reconstituted by it. Thus, recognition cannot be considered without history, a point I intend to return in the third part of my intervention today. Recognition is not the beginning of a relationship. It is the beginning of a new or a renewed relationship. There are no people aborigine at the moment of recognition. Interestingly, Aboriginal Latin for at the beginning is the origin of Aboriginal. The settler collective routinely frames recognition as if it was Aboriginal, as if it was there first. But this obviously makes sense only if you are psychologically disturbed to the point of unrecognition. For this reason, recognition cannot be about the settler sovereign realizing that there is another, and then making it sovereign through a sovereign act that confirms its sovereignty and subsumes the other one. Recognition cannot be performed by inclusion because the settler sovereign did not enact its sovereignty without the indigenous one in the first place. It enacted it against the indigenous one. And for the settler sovereign, it wasn't even a first place since the settlers came from elsewhere. Recognition must be about a sovereign reconstitution, and there is constitution in reconstitution, not about its amendment. A revolutionary passage is needed, a point Mahmoud Mamdani also powerfully makes in his latest book, Need a Settler, Not Native. If it is ever going to be, genuine recognition must be a moment of synthesis, a moment of dialectical progression, the moment in which thesis and antithesis in their opposition are overcome through recognition. Keeping history out, asserting the settlers' political aboriginality preempts recognition. Aboriginality is used within inverted commas and refers to the meaning of aboriginality that derives from its etymology. We need the truth, we need history, and yet paradoxically, recognition also aims to undo history. A genuine process of recognition leading to political reconciliation would also make history relevant. Ernst Renan and Friedrich Nietzsche, for example, both of whom reflected extensively on the nature of reconciliation, they were both dealing with mighty historical grudges, agreed that reconciliation is primarily predicated on the ability and willingness to forget history. Renan was thinking about nations and nationalities. He was in the business of denying that nations are defined by race, language, ethnography, geography, and religion. But he also talked more generally about the ways in which historical inquiry, a quote from him, throws light on the violent acts that have taken place at the origin of every political formation, which sounds right on the money for the polities that have emerged from settler colonial processes of indigenous dispossession and erasure. The thesis is an original indigenous sovereignty. Its denial by the settler polity is the antithesis. Indigenous resurgence through struggle, forcing a reconstitution, may be a synthesis. Then there is the second part of my intervention today, which I'm not going to read. It's entitled Disturbing Settlers. And I'm toying with the notion that we need to disturb settlers, disturbing settlers, and also we should understand that they are disturbing, that approaching them is disturbing. It's compelling scholarship, and I recommend everybody to read it, but I'm going to skip it, and I'm going to go straight to the third part of my intervention, and I hope it makes sense. So, shame is crucial for remembering, which is crucial for reconciliation and recognition, and so is forgetting. It is a paradox, and navigating this paradox demands truth-telling in a historical register. History is, again, a battlefield, even if the history wars really were never over. It is not only about settler colonialism as a specific mode of domination, of course, and many statues celebrating colonizers in public places were toppled in several countries in 2020, while the President's Advisory 1776 Commission, a response to the New York Times 1629 project, was one of the United States President Donald Trump's parting gift in early 2021. But in the specific predicament of the countries facing the need to recognize indigenous sovereignties in particular, it is not truth-telling in a moral or an ethical register that is needed, even though they both may help. In these instances, it is truth-telling in an historical register that is needed for the simultaneous purpose of remembering and forgetting. This is, in my opinion, one of the implications of the slogan "Truth Before Treaty." The indigenous collectives that resist settler recognition and indigenous collectives that seek settler recognition would agree on this understanding. There would be no uneven geography of indigenous engagement here. We need a historical kind of truth. This is not to say that a moral or an ethical truth would not be true, only that it would not be as useful as historical truth is for the purpose of remembering and forgetting. Historical truth is not merely a demand for respect or reparation, even though, again, respect and reparations are absolutely necessary. Historical truth is needed to make sure that recognition does not amount to a denial or a subsumption of Indigenous sovereignties. Without history, recognition within settler colonialism takes the form of a subsumption of Indigenous sovereignty, which makes authentic recognition impossible. This subsumption is something the Indigenous collectives that refuse recognition are determined to preempt, but those who demand Indigenous recognition are keen to avoid it too, only they have other priorities. No uneven geography here either. Warning against the rules of consent, Audra Simpson argues that refusal rather than recognition is an option for producing and maintaining alternative structures of thought, politics, and traditions away from an uncritical relationship to states. A settler offer of recognition is a denial of Indigenous sovereignty. Simpson's argument is incontrovertible, but settler foreclosure of recognition is also denial of Indigenous sovereignty, even though this denial cannot extinguish Indigenous sovereignty. It is another paradox, leading to a dilemma. Engaging and non-engaging in recognition both result in a strategic impasse, because substantive Indigenous sovereignty is both a prerequisite and the outcome of recognition. It must exist before recognition, and yet it will also be reconstituted by it. But with history, Indigenous sovereignty does exist before recognition. It is not that an Indigenous sovereignty or a cluster of sovereign arrangements was once terminated and recognition would bring it back into existence. It always existed, and not only because it was never ceded to settlers who relied on self-serving and erroneous assumptions about terra nullius, or because it was disavowed after it had been ostensibly recognized by settlers who relied on wishful thinking in relation to legal doctrines of discovery. These are the two basic models of settler lawfare. Substantive Indigenous sovereignty already exists because settler colonialism as a mode of domination aims to destroy it, but was historically unable to. Indigenous sovereignty emerges in the struggle against settler colonialism, is relational and dynamic, as well as an a priori, which makes it resilient. Not something from the 18th century that is to be revived. It exists in history, not before history. Likewise, and conversely, by foreclosing Indigenous sovereignty, the settler polity denies itself a target. Its efforts are always frustrated. Settler colonialism as a specific mode of domination is relational, and yet it disavows its relationality by proclaiming the extinctions of Indigenous sovereignty in a way that ultimately and paradoxically sustains them. It is not that the settler colonial polity was wrong in not recognizing Indigenous sovereignty, even though it was wrong, and that now it should undo this wrong. Recognition is about realizing that the settler polity failed in its sustained attempt to erase Indigenous sovereignties, and that now it should recognize this failure. So, history first, and then forgetfulness. You can't forget something you do not know or foreclose. Thus, the often repeated notions that Aboriginal sovereignties were never ceded, therefore a demand for a treaty or treaties, is not an impediment to recognition, as the Australian government argues, since it would be unpalatable to a majority of Australians, as if anybody's political preferences may deny the accuracy of the historical record. The notion of a substantive Indigenous sovereignty is the very condition of possibility for recognition, an asset, not a liability. For the purpose of its constitutional ordering, settler Australia is by all means and purposes a successor state, not the successor to a series of colonial arrangements superseded by federation, but the successor to Aboriginal sovereign Australia. That is, Aboriginal sovereignties precede the Australian one, not the other way around. A referendum on a statement of historical fact does not seem like a reasonable proposition. It would be like conducting a referendum about suspending the general principles of thermodynamics. It would be nice, but it would fall beyond the limits of the Australian polity in its current configuration. That principle applies universally and does not depend on the will of a majority. Likewise, when it comes to Aboriginal substantive sovereignty, the settler does not get to have a say. That's what recognition looks like. So, a treaty, a marker of recognition, but and we should be clear about this, a treaty, and for the record, nations do sign treaties with themselves, pace John Howard, they are called constitutions. A treaty cannot be the end of the story. Incidentally, if and when the Australian Constitution is amended in order to include a recognition of the special status of Aboriginal Australians, it will be not the first time. Before 1967, Aboriginal Australians were also explicitly singled out in the constitutional text. They may be so again. In the original text, they and no one else could not be counted or represented. Conceptually, a constitutional provision that gives them a voice in Parliament would not be an earth-shattering innovation. They and no one else could be counted or represented in an institutional body that would express their voice. At first, before 1967, they could not be represented. Then they could be represented, but only by someone else. In the future, they may represent themselves. The end of a journey remained unfinished in 1967. So a new constitution may be a treaty, but treaties are many things. And in this instance, the treaty may be seen as a contract designed to manage ongoing relationships. Think about a lease agreement and not a contract of sale. The latter, the latter is a treaty that is designed to terminate a relationship. The notion of a contract is so important to our legal orders and yet so ambiguous. And ongoing and discontinuous are definitely not the same. Canadian Indigenous scholar Cliff Atlier has remarked on the differences between received Western liberal understandings of contract and Indigenous interpretations of treaty, and noted that Indigenous peoples understand treaty as a marriage, while the colonists treat it as a divorce. A treaty would not be the end of the story, or the end of history either. So much of what I believe are superficial readings of Patrick Wolf's rendition of the settler colonial logic of elimination. They've been offered by some scholars for some years now. Readings that ascribe to him and to settler colonial studies as an intellectual endeavor in general, an unwillingness to consider Indigenous agency, and a pessimistic dismissal of Indigenous efforts to uphold Indigenous sovereignty in the face of the settler colonial onslaught. On the contrary, it is an understanding of the specific history and dynamic of settler colonial domination, an understanding that offers an historically grounded understanding of the ways in which Indigenous sovereignty was protected and dynamically reconfigured through struggle. This understanding may enable a type of recognition that is neither a substantiation of Indigenous sovereignty nor its repression. This is what decolonization may look like. We must craft a third way between a settler denial of recognition and Indigenous subsumption. Settler recognition is crucial in both senses, as argued in this paper, that of the recognition by settlers of unsurrendered Indigenous sovereign prerogatives, and that of the recognition of settlers and of their specific collective psychology, which was the part that I didn't read. Settler colonial discourse routinely represents the interests of what is a particular political project. For example, the constitution and perpetration of a settler colonial regime in the language of universal rights. And as Guillaume Proulx and Nicholas John Crane have noted in a perceptive article dedicated to the discursive and material construction of settler colonial landscape, in a language premised on the practiced naturalization of claims to neutrality and objectivity. This is a profoundly ideological discourse and mode of representation. But the answer is not a corresponding particularism, not even an Indigenous particularism. We need Indigenous nationalism, and we need to articulate them with relentless critique of the settler colonial ideology. We need to repossess universalism. We all need liberation from settler colonialism. We all need a revolutionary form of recognition. This predicament reminds me of the criticism of political economy that Marx puts forward in Capital. There is a striking homology. I'm reading from his. Political economy joyfully proclaims the theory that the capitalist mode of production is an eternal necessity ordained by nature. The same is with settler colonialism and the subsumption by recognition and the denial of recognition false alternative. They both proclaim that settler colonialism as a mode of domination is eternal and natural, even if at times there is a recognition that it may be regrettable, and that therefore it could be modified and adjusted or endured, but never negated. In these worldviews, there is nothing outside of settler colonialism. Crucially, Marx adds that the distortion is one result of political economy's inability to perceive its object of study historically as a social object and as a social construct. Marx then proceeds to understand capitalism historically in order to highlight the possibility of its negation. The same is for settler colonialism. It is a social construct. There was society before and there will be society after it. This means that its negation must be discovered, not invented. Substantive indigenous sovereignties have been there all along and must be discovered, not constituted. We need to discover a substantive indigenous sovereignty, but then where is it? My suggestion is that we should recognize that Aboriginal sovereignty is located in history and in a relation. That is, not in a prehistorical time that precedes the colonial encounter and survived because it was never ceded, even if it was never ceded. I call for an approach that is likely to be undermined by settler colonial discourse and by its mobilization of what Patrick Wolf termed repressive authenticity, the corrosive suggestion and insinuation that can take multiple forms, that contemporary Aboriginal insurgent demands are illegitimate because they are discontinuous with those of traditional or authentic Aboriginal societies. A bit like saying that the current residents of the United Kingdom are not authentically British as they do not behave and interact as their ancestors did in the late 18th century. Indigenous peoples globally have also been practicing repressive authenticity. They did so for their own purposes and legitimately. Wolf developed the notion of repressive authenticity in his 1990s commentary on Australia's native title legislation. But its practice is repressive, whether it applies to actual existing Indigenous people and whether it applies to pretenders who have no rightful claim to indigeneity. Like Zizek astutely noted, a paranoid husband is paranoid irrespective of whether his wife sleeps around. The New York Times ran a story on some scholarly impostors in academia in May 2021. They are imposters, and they should stop posing. But an obsession with calling them out, while entirely understandable, is also an instance of repressive authenticity. Similarly, Stuart Hall, even if he was talking about Black culture, and even if he was talking about the politics of difference in an earlier era, a passage that occurred before the official embrace of difference by neoliberal cultural institutions, warned against the risk of policing boundaries that are, of course, political, symbolic, and positional, as if they were genetic. It is not genetic, it is historical. Substantive Indigenous sovereignty is to be discovered in the ongoing and historical resistance and revolutionary steadfastness of Aboriginal anti-colonialism. Thank you.
Thank you, Lorenzo. What a rich paper. We've had a number of people coming through in the Q&A saying, can we read the paper? Can we get the whole paper? Where is the paper published? So we'll talk to you about that later, and hopefully we can share with our listeners today. A reminder to people listening in, please use the Q&A function to type in your questions, and we'll see how many we can get through in the last 15 minutes or so of our session today. The first question that I have here comes from Dawn Waleski, who's writing in from unceded Oneida Nation land in rural central New York State, US, so global reach today. And the question was, she has a number of questions, but the first one here is about the third R, reparations, so land back, handing over wealth, credit and positioning. And she's asking what you imagine the role and protocol for settlers is regarding reparations. And I think this is a debate that's going to heat up as we move towards treaty in Victoria as well.
We are already talking. That's wonderful. We are already trying to find, ways of imagining a decolonial predicament. The way I see it, a substantive recognition of Indigenous sovereignty may take the practical shape of an overlay, a fiscal overlay, a land tax. Even it should not be limited to this intervention. It is about paying the rent, but it would also make Indigenous country more sustainable because many damaging and extractivist operations would cease as they would become unprofitable. So you see, I pay rents, I pay rates, and I pay to a bunch of thieves. I don't see a massive conceptual difference in also paying tax for inhabiting indigenous country. It's a fiscal overlay. It's something we can imagine. It's something we can understand because we can see ourselves as lessers on indigenous land rather than owning it, right? It's a shift, but I should also add that a treaty and in our collective imagination, a treaty looks like a contract of real estate, can be about the permanent relinquishment of an interest in land, or an understanding that that we are renters on Aboriginal land. I don't know if this is something worth considering, but we still need to sign treaties. We just have to understand them differently.
Yes, I agree. And I know from the work that we've been doing with Wurundjeri on treaty engagement over the last couple of years. I mean, obviously the land question is very central, with a deep suspicion that the whole treaty process has been established to fully dispossess them of remaining lands. And lots of conversations happening about the type of the other types of relations to land that might be imagined through treaty. But I think it's a long road ahead to see what the treaty framework in Victoria offers in relation to land. But then I think it's a no-brainer that we should be paying rent, and there are lots of ways in which we could imagine doing that through a treaty arrangement. And there are lots of other ways that we can also be thinking about reparations through the treaty process. So time will tell. Another question here. Someone said they missed what you were saying about the difference between urban and rural Aboriginal people in relation to recognition. And can you restate that? If not, we can circulate the paper. But do you want to come back to that point?
I would certainly be more than happy to circulate the paper.
I'm keen to read it.
We live off the written word. The point I want to make is that there is an uneven geography of Indigenous engagement with recognition. And this is true globally. In some settler polities, recognition is an Indigenous demand. I'm thinking of Israel, for example, and in other settler polities, the Indigenous movements for resurgence are much more wary of the prospect of a settler mandated form of recognition. And my work on a contextual understanding of recognition can explain these uneven geography, because both constituencies, both Indigenous struggles and Indigenous constituencies are subjected to settler colonialism as a mode of domination, but their different responses depend on a particular configuration of settler discourse. And this is true of different polities, but it's also true within politics. And so I was referring to the enormous gap that there is in Aboriginal opinion and politics between Aboriginal urban people that live in Western Sydney and people that live in North Queensland. And these insurgent politics are very different, and they demand of the settler polity different avenues towards the question of recognition. So I was merely observing that whenever we should think about Indigenous opinion in relation to recognition, we should take these differences into account, and they are meaningful and very relevant to an understanding of recognition.
Thank you. Another question here from Minaka, who's writing from Larrakia country, it's up in Darwin, who is asking a question about white settler anxiety and pointing to the fact that, you know, in the debates following the Mabo decision, there were a lot of white settlers who were afraid of losing their land, although I will also note that that fear and anxiety was deliberately stoked by the government and subsequent governments. The question is, how do we calm their fears? I wonder if that's the right question for you, or how you think about that question of the settler's emotional state in relation to these new forms of recognition you're proposing.
Look, this is a wonderful question, and the cheap cop-out would be, you should read the second part of my paper. But in the meantime, I would like to stress that normally and typically, the assumption is that by uncovering violence, but uncovering illegitimacy, the settler would say, yeah, radio, we tried, we should do something different. It doesn't work like that. The problem is not a lack of knowledge. We know. The problem is denial. Denial increases with knowledge. The more you know, the more you deny, the more you are facing a violent history, the more violent your reaction, the more anxious you become. So what the settler needs is an intervention. Forgive me, the pun is intended. This intervention is also a call for an intervention. We need productive shame, not a shame that creates a foreclosure that is responded with foreclosure, but creative shame, productive shame. We need specific techniques to approach a very, very, very disturbed psychology. And there are techniques for this. There are ways of making sure that the settler is not shamed, but productively shamed, creatively shamed. There is a growing literature on the particular psychopathological disposition of settlers, and in my paper I do talk about this, and I do think about ways in which we could productively mobilize shame in ways that do not produce foreclosure.
I want to pick up on that. This is a question from me now before I go back to the Q&A, because this is an ongoing conversation that's happening around treaty, but I think, you know, there's a long history of this idea that to make progress, whatever that looks like in Indigenous settler relations, but let's say for the sake of the current moment that it is about treaty and treaty relationships, that I've become very anxious whenever I've heard people say, oh, we need to build a movement of support. We need to mobilize you know, non-Indigenous settler support for treaty. And I think, no, we don't. Like, if treaty becomes you know, a populist, that popular support is necessary for treaty to proceed, it will never happen. And I think we have a lot of history in Australia to suggest that. And I think one of the things that's very much in favour of the Victorian process so far is that it's happening in a fairly low-key way, and that it is understood that the parties to the treaty are the state and First Nations, not and yes, the state is constituted by democratic representation, but nonetheless, this isn't about securing popular support for treaty among the wider population. And so I guess I just wonder what you're saying in relation to that, whether, you know, my sense is surely we can have treaty and then we can be concerned with what people think about it afterwards, like non-Indigenous people. But if we have to secure non-Indigenous support first, I think we'll end up down the same cul-de-sac.
Oh, look, in my paper, I do say that we do not need a majority to agree on a statement of fact.
Yes.
The settler doesn't get to recognize that Aboriginal communities and sovereignties were here first. It's just like there are some things we must accept, like the ultimate, entropic death of the universe. We cannot have a vote about it, right? At the same time, though, in order to have a process of recognition, that it's not about a treaty. A process of recognition is a process of reconstitution of the settler as settler and indigenous as indigenous. We need to understand the particular psychological position of the settler. This understanding is an asset. It's not a pampering. It's not done for the purpose of promoting support for change. That must happen anyway. It's done for the purpose of helping, for turning settlers into co-belligerents, for showing that there is a better life beyond and outside of settler colonialism. It's not that the settlers must be convinced that relinquishing their privilege is going to be good in general. We've got to convince them that it's going to be good for them in particular. And for that, we need to have a conversation about them and an intervention.
I think we've got time to sneak in one more question before we wrap up. And this one comes from one of our colleagues across the ditch in Aotearoa. Hema Pereki asks whether, he says that in a paper he has coming out in December, that he argues that settler colonialism should be retermed as invader colonialism. These debates around the use of the term settler have accompanied the development of settler colonial theory. What are your current thoughts on that question?
Okay, this is also a cop-out, but whether we name it settler colonialism or invader colonialism, it's irrelevant, because as we are talking about a relationship, our understanding of what we are talking about is predicated on a recognition of indigenous sovereignties. So my hunch is that nomenclature is somewhat irrelevant in the context of a relationship in which we are necessarily dealing with two sovereignties mutually encountering each other and reconstituting themselves as they go about it. Also, going back to your prior question, my feeling is that we should proceed on both tracks. We should proceed with treaty and recognition as if no settler was involved, and we should aim towards the reconstitution of the settler home as that of a guest. We can do both. They're not mutually exclusive.
Thanks so much, Lorenzo. I look forward to reading the paper fully and picking up on some of these threads with you in future conversations. For now, we're going to wrap up for today. I just want to remind you all that we have our final ISRC webinar for the year coming up on the 24th of November with none other than Leanne Betta-Samasake-Simpson, someone whose thinking I've found hugely influential and very powerful. So please, if you haven't registered for that, please do. Thank you, Lorenzo, so much for sharing that paper with us. I think you might have ruffled some feathers around your acknowledging country statement, judging on the Q&A, but that's also something to pick up and to note in future conversations. But we very much appreciate the time and the intellectual rigor that you bring to this work. And we thank you as always for being a friend to the ISRC. Thank you everyone for joining us. I hope we see lots of you in November. Thanks. Goodbye.
Thank you. Thank you all.